All right. This is going to be part 2 of the Chapter 7 lecture on the first 2 years of psychosocial development. This time I'm going to focus on social bonding. I'll talk to you about synchrony, social referencing, and attachment, all really important aspects of developing relationships with young children. When we talk about the development of social bonds, what we're really discussing are the ways that a responsive caregiver, usually an adult, sometimes it could be a sibling, and an infant or toddler are able to relate to each other. Because of the vast differences in cognitive and language capacities, the older individual usually has to adjust his or her behavior in order to get in sync with the baby. So developmentalists talk about this phenomena that they call synchrony, which is a coordinated, rapid, fluid, smooth exchange of nonverbal back and forth interaction between a caregiver and an infant. So a mom and a baby that are experiencing synchrony together are maybe smiling at one another, and one catches the other's smile and smiles back, or perhaps there's a change in facial expression from smile to serious that the other imitates. That kind of coordinated back and forth nonverbal interaction is synchrony. And synchrony is really important for organizing the child's social behaviors. As the baby gets a little bit older, the synchrony experience becomes more frequent and more elaborate. As a parent or a caregiver, you feel this change in connectivity, and it really seems to blossom from, in my experience, about 3 months onward. It gets better and better. Even though synchrony is achievable under 3 months, it is something that I feel becomes increasingly more complex as the baby gets better at recognizing faces and reading cues, and as they get better and better at imitation. Imitation is where you copy what the other person's doing, and one of the best ways to get into a synchronous routine with a baby is to simply begin by matching a behavior that the infant does. Imitate the baby, they'll get a kick out of it, then they might try to imitate you. They might even do that first, but imitation games are a great way to create that sense of connectivity. So is finding a way to share affect with each other. Babies are actually highly tuned to looking at people's faces, and they will really be discerning and picking up on any change in your facial expression. So doing high affect games is really fun at this age and really helps to develop the social structures of their brains. In fact, if a baby experiences a lack of connectedness with a caregiver, a lack of synchrony, what your textbook refers to as neglected synchrony, then what we see is that the babies become very upset, disorganized, and stressed out. So, for example, scientists will do experiments where they'll have a mother with her baby. They'll look at babies of different ages in what we would call a still-faced paradigm or a still face technique. And basically, the experimenter would say to the mom, I'd like you to play with your baby as you usually would. And there's some back and forth and some child-directed speech and lots of high affect and giggles usually. Then, at a certain moment, the experimenter will instruct the parent to now adopt a completely still, almost frozen facial expression. Don't change it in a negative or a positive way. Just look blankly at the direction of the infant. In these studies, when babies see their mother often not responding, not engaging in a synchronous back and forth fluid interaction, a healthy baby becomes very distressed and disorganized. They are attentive to those cues, and they are dependent on those cues. So the still-faced experiments are not comfortable for babies to go through, but babies are also resilient. We all are designed to go through time periods where perhaps our caregivers are not as responsive as we would prefer. So these experiments don't harm a baby because they're just a one-time kind of practice. But if a baby has ongoing chronic experiences of being with a caregiver who is not responsive to the affect of the behavior of the baby, who is not really trying to either comfort or respond or engage, that lack of synchrony over the long term can have significant adverse effects on the developing brain, nervous system, and really behaviors and trust of the developing child. So, parent child interaction, that sense of connectedness and synchrony, absolutely critical. And some of that shared affective play over time leads to a phenomena that we refer to as social referencing. So this emerges a little bit later, more like 6 to 9 months, and it's when a child recognizes, here comes this unusual situation. I don't know how to react to this situation. And the child recognizes that this almost innate desire to look at the caregiver's face, to look to the adult in the room and see, how is this person going to feel about whatever's about to happen that I don't understand? If the parent responds in a positive way by smiling and welcoming whatever this new event is, the baby is much more likely to then behave in a way that also shows appreciation and openness and support. If, on the other hand, the baby looks to the parent and sees an expression of fear or distrust or danger, then the baby is much more likely to adopt that emotional tone and to also express fear of the unknown. So social referencing is a pretty early emerging social behavior in toddlerhood. It's a really important one because we learn about the world by checking in with the facial expressions of those around us. And if you don't know to do this, you're missing out on a whole lot of really important information, particularly information about the social and emotional world. In fact, in my area of work, we look for a lack of social referencing in young children with autism. It's an important marker early on. It's as if children with autism don't have the instinct to know that they can rely on the emotional information on somebody else's face to figure out what to do. Instead, they seem to try to manage these challenging or ambiguous situations just on their own without referencing to other people for emotional information. So, referencing is an important extension of synchrony. It's a developmentally appropriate way of getting social and emotional information by checking in with your caregiver. And we want to see children doing this after about the age of 6 to 9 months. Now, in addition to synchrony and social referencing, when we think about the social bonds during infancy and toddlerhood, we're also interested in attachment. Parent-child attachment is a really important topic in child development, and I encourage you to pay a lot of attention to this section in your textbooks. Attachment is the lasting emotional bond that one person has with another. And it's thought that our capacity to bond with other people is really shaped by what goes on for us when we are infants and when we are toddlers. So the quality of that lasting emotional bond that we have with a caregiver is going to become really important to how we function socially in future relationships. In fact, the impact of attachment is probably even more significant than the impact of synchrony when it comes to long-term social and emotional outcomes for children. Attachment is usually seen by looking at what the child does when there's a change in the environment. So a healthy attachment is often seen by having the young child go closer to the parent. That's proximity seeking. So if you seek comfort by getting closer to a parent, it's usually a sign of a healthier attachment. It also has to do with the different ways that a child maintains that contact, and there are healthy ways and unhealthy ways, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, just like any other developmental capacity, there are stages of attachment. So attachment is not just a classification or a category that you have across your lifespan. So up to about 6 weeks, scientists don't really think attachment is possible. Newborns are signaling their needs and caregivers are responding, and there usually is a positive response to being comforted. So the more that the infant connects the caregiver with a good feeling, the more interaction will grow. So pre-attachment doesn't mean it's completely absent. I don't mean to overstate that, but it is before it's really clearly differentiated. Interestingly, though, newborns are primed, like infrastructurally, their brains are ready to be able to recognize familiar faces and familiar voices. So from birth, the infant knows who mom is for sure. And if there's consistent ongoing contact with a partner, that person will be known too. Now, from the period of 6 weeks to 8 months, attachment is really developing. This is when infants start to show preferences for certain people. They'll smile more, laugh more, babble and vocalize more when they see that familiar person. And you can usually observe a change in the infant's behavior when familiar people are engaging with them. Now, to Erickson, who you might remember from psychosocial theory, this is the time where trust develops and the infant begins to count on, hopefully, the people around him. From about 8 months to 2 years, we usually see what's called a period of a classic secure attachment. That's what you want. You want to see a healthy attachment between parent and child. This should usually emerge at this time. If it doesn't emerge at this time, it is possible that there are problems in the parent-child relationship that need to be attended to. So what are you aspiring to? Well, from 8 months to 2 years, you really want to see that an infant will show some sort of a greeting to the primary caregiver, often the mom, sometimes a father, sometimes an aunt or a grandparent. By greet, I don't mean say hello, but more smile, show a response, demonstrate some kind of movement toward the person who's just entering the room. Usually a young child who's securely attached plays happily when he or she is just near the caregiver. There might be, or there should be actually, developmentally, it's perfectly appropriate for there to be some separation anxiety when the caregiver leaves. Usually in a healthy relationship, the infant and the caregiver want to be near each other. They frequently look at each other, and there's often a lot of nonverbal engagement and touching. So as a psychologist, if I'm called in to look at a parent-child relationship, one of the first things that I try to do is set up a situation where there are some toys the child could play with by herself and some that it would be helpful to have the parent engage with. And I just sit back and encourage the parent to go ahead and play with the child as they'd like. That the goal is just to help the child to get comfortable in the room. And in those first few moments, where maybe the parent and I are even chatting or catching up on the child's history, you can see by the nonverbal behaviors of the parent some things about the relationship that can be very telling. So you are looking for this sort of desire for proximity, keeping the other person in the visual field and checking in and looking for physical back and forth. If it's not there, it could be that it's a temperamental tendency. It's not a problem. It's just a style difference. Other times, if it's not there, we do become concerned, either about the child having an underlying social disability or communication disability or emotional problem, or sometimes the problem is in the parent having an emotional difficulty, maybe going through a period of depression, or perhaps having anger issues. So there are a host of reasons that you may see a not very good parent-child relationship. It doesn't always mean it's bad parenting. It doesn't always mean it's a child with a problem. Sometimes it's the interaction of various circumstances that need some intervention from the outside. And in my experience, parents are almost always doing the very best they know how to do. And sometimes what an interventionist can do is promote a better quality social bond between parent and child by demonstrating for an adult who maybe wasn't parented very well some ways that they could parent their child. So this time period of 8 months to 2 years is when we start to see a healthy, secure attachment emerge if it's there. And if it isn't there, it's a really good time to try to find some ways to enrich the parent-child relationship. If this is an area that's of interest to you, one of the professors in HDFS, Zeynep Beringen, Biringen, is doing a set of studies on parent-child interaction and really looking at the style between the two. She's often looking for undergraduates for research assistantships, and she could also just be a really good mentor if you are interested in this area. So from the ages of 2 to 6 years, you begin to see that this early childhood attachment has now become the foundation for exploring the social world and getting to know other people. So in those preschool years, which we'll talk about in the next section, you start to see how the child's social style is built upon what their attachment patterns were like when they were younger. So around this time, children are becoming more independent, but they still rely on caregivers to praise them, to comfort them, and to interact with them in a responsive way. From 6 to 12 years, we then look more at what we would call a cultural attachment, which is where children seek to make their caregivers proud often, and adults seek to let the children know how proud they are of them. We often see loyalty developing, and you will have as much attachment to peers sometimes, or to interests, as you do to family figures for a while. And from 12 to 18 years, peers can become the most important attachment figures, and we start to see this developmental progression from having parents as your primary attachment figures to now moving into adult relationships. So without getting ahead of ourselves too much developmentally, it's just good to know that there's a typical developmental trajectory underlying attachment, or that healthy, secure relationship between parent and child. The kind of secure relationship where you don't expect perfection, but most of the time the parent is responsive to the child and vice versa. So, how do we measure attachment? How do we get a handle on what kind of an attachment style a particular parent and child have together? Well, one of the more famous measures in developmental science is the strange situation, which is a laboratory-based procedure where the examiner sets up different situations for the adults to try to do, and then watches what the child does in those situations and codes their behavior. So it usually begins by having the parent and the child in an unfamiliar playroom, and there are several toys around, and after a few minutes, a very prescribed script is enacted where the examiner asks the parent to leave the room. Then the people observing will look to see, has the child been exploring toys? Is the child maintaining close proximity to the parent? Is there a lot of visual checking in back and forth? Once the caregiver leaves, does the toddler look like she misses her? Usually there is a brief period of distress that resolves. That's healthy. And then in a secure attachment, you're likely to see that when the mother's instructed to come back into the playroom, a securely attached toddler welcomes the caregiver's reappearance, hugs them, is happy, it's all over, and it's good. So in the strange situation where we have different strange opportunities to be separated from your parent and reunited, basically, observers can then code different behaviors and classify a parent-child pair into 4 different attachment categories: securely attached, insecure avoidant attachment, insecure resistant or ambivalent attachment, or a disorganized attachment. Now, each of these is a very interesting subgroup, and they've been associated over time with very different patterns. So let me try to describe for you what each of these would look like. In a secure attachment, you have a relationship where the infant is getting both comfort and some mastery experiences from the presence of the caregiver. So they feel good when the caregiver is there, and they miss them when they're not, but they reunite just fine when they come back. In an insecure avoidant attachment, you have a time where an infant avoids connecting with the caregiver, seems to maybe be ambivalent or not really care if the caregiver's there. When they leave, they don't really seem to care about that. and they don't really seem to care when the caregiver returns. So insecure avoidant is a kind of a lack of emotional response to either being with or being away from the caregiver. In an insecure resistant or ambivalent attachment, you have this sense that there's anxiety and uncertainty for the infant, as if it's unknown what's going to happen. The infant often becomes very upset at separation from the caregiver and then will resist reconnecting, but at the same time kind of seek contact. So it's like a push-pull kind of thing for the parent and can be really difficult to comfort. So an insecure, resistant, or ambivalent attachment has an anxious quality to it, where it doesn't seem as though the infant experiences the caregiver as a consistent source of comfort and connection. Then a disorganized attachment is an infant whose responses are very inconsistent. In other words, they don't neatly fit into any of the previous categories, and it's difficult to know what variables are impacting the attachment style of the young child. So when we look at these patterns of attachment, it's just good to think about some of the behavioral markers, some of the things that the child does, but also note this is transactional. In other words, there's an aspect to this that the adult is also bringing to the equation. And the percentage of toddlers that are in each of these categories. So what you'll see is that the majority of children, more than half, are usually scoring in the secure range, with approximately 10 to 20% who have some variety of an insecure attachment. Now, attachment isn't just relevant for mothers. It's also relevant for any family member that's going to take a day-to-day role in caretaking. So fathers as social partners is another really important place to look at synchrony, attachment, and social referencing. In fact, there are some studies that suggest that fathers sometimes do more overt social bonding behaviors with their children than mothers. And it's thought that that can happen if the culture of the family is for the mother to do more of the instrumental caregiving, like bathing and feeding, and the father is more engaged in playful interactions. But it could also be related to fathers just being naturally skilled at these things in ways that our culture has not yet appreciated. In fact, in the United States, fathers in all ethnic groups have been found to be more active with their children than their fathers were with them. So we are seeing fathers getting increasingly involved in their children's lives. And as you can see here from studies that were done about the social bond, comparing mothers and fathers, mothers tended to be more involved in caregiving, comforting, and smiling. Fathers in more jokey, kind of eliciting more smiles, so I guess dad jokes are a real thing, and playing more exciting games, particularly rough and tumble play, tends to be more common in fathers, and is another really important part of mixing the social bond with the growth of sensory motor skills. So in conclusion, the individual care by stable caregivers, boy, it's so important for developing a secure attachment. Every infant, every young child is going to benefit from and truly needs responsive caregivers. Whether you are with that baby for a brief time or you are the primary caregiver, being responsive to the child's emotional displays and engaging them in play at that nonverbal level is going to be very important. Relationships really do shape the brains of young children, particularly in the areas that help us become well-regulated emotional adults. So thanks a lot for your time and attention. I'm sorry my voice got a little raspy. Too many lectures. This concludes our lectures from Chapter 7. Thanks.